All right, so it's time to start introducing your final, and yes, I was lagging behind in actually producing this for you, and I probably still have a few things that I need to, think through critically and make sure that they're perfect, but this is essentially the skeleton for what's going to be your final, and we can at least get started on it now. So I call this topographical space because what it really is it's a generative design exercise that's meant to basically separate you from the design process a little bit so that you don't have to make too many decisions. And it gives you a kind of a framework around which you can begin to design something that winds up being very interesting, but doesn't require a lot of detail, but still has that same kind of beauty behind your design prowess and expertise. So it's a three-step process. The first step is going to be an analysis of a geometrical pattern, and I have some examples in here for us to get started with, but it's not the only one that you can use. I'll explain that in a moment. Step two is to recreate that pattern using a set of rules that you've established off of your analysis. So similar to what we did before, but again, very, very simple. It shouldn't take us very long. And then step three is to actually three-dimensionalize that pattern. So I'll show you sort of an example, and I'll pull in more examples later on of the kind of application that this should wind up looking like. But anyway, much like we've been exploring before, you're going to have a full-scale model and you're going to have a studio scale model. Okay, so just be thinking about both scales at the same time while you're designing. But the objective here is, like I said, it's a generative design exercise. So we're actually creating like an exterior event space, gathering space, like a city plaza. Not quite like a park or anything like that, more like a plaza with multi-levels that has a bit of an architectural definition, but not overwhelmingly architecture and not overwhelmingly, flat. Does that make any sense? So this example that you see on the wall is it's a design exercise that I actually did in school myself, and it was an adaptation of a Nina Simone song. So I took the dynamics of her pitch and her tempo, and started to create rule sets, basically an algorithm for how I began to apply that geometry on the sheet. That's basically it, and that's what it came out to be. Okay, so I had very little to do with how it came out, right? So my first step was, and I forget all the rules actually, but let's say the pitch at every eighth note in this particular selection of the song was indicative of the radius of the circle. Okay, and then I start at the bottom left corner, and the first eighth note is that radius. Then I went to the next corner, did the next radius. Then I went to the next one, did the next radius for the next eighth note, all the way around. And I kept doing that until I got to the last corner, and then I started to do intersections between circles. So I jumped from the four corners to everywhere that the circles crossed, and I did another circle at a different radius. So, I didn't make very many decisions besides to say that pitch is indicative of radius and the order in which I applied the circles. That's about it. Okay, so that's kind of the level of integration that I want you as the designer to get into. So let's start talking about what we're actually doing. The assignment itself does have some program, and that's what you see here, but it's super minimal. It should accommodate a sort of look and feel of how it would engage space. Okay, so minimum of 2 entry points, and if you look really closely at the image, you'll see it a little better when you have it on your screen. But this would be considered like an entry point where there was some leftover, leftover space that didn't quite get, encapsulated in the actual system, and I used that as an architectural feature, something like that. So a minimum of 2 entry points, open view into the plaza from at least 2 sides. So basically if you put like a perspective on that side, or you look at it from perspective in Rhino, you should be able to see, down or up into this thing with relative ease. And that's pretty subjective. It's up to you to decide whether or not you consider that an open view. outdoor environment really just means that it's not an enclosed space. And that would be 3 large spaces of approximately 800 to 1,000 square feet, 4 to 6 semi-private flat areas, which could be, you know, like, I don't know, like mini auditoriums, or, you know, like a sunken pit or something like that. So, you know, I'm just giving you real world examples of the kind of environment that that's supposed to be indicative of. And those are 200 to 400 square feet. And then 3 interior environments. You'll need a cafe at 700, shops at 500 square feet, and a visitor center at 900 square feet. So you'll notice that I put the requirements up top for a full-scale model at 100 feet by 60 feet. That's only 6,000 square feet. And I've given you, just in the first one, that's 3,000 square feet, potentially, and then the other one is 2,000 square feet, and then I've given you over 1,000 square feet for the other program. So what does that tell you? Right. It tells you some of your program is going to exist above or below other program in some way. Okay. And again, this is all pretty loose. I really don't want you to get hung up on whether or not your shop is exactly 500 square feet. Put a box that's 500 square feet and then start your design around it, and at a certain point where you feel comfortable, delete it. Right? So kind of like what we did with our previous exercise. Okay? So before I get into the inspiration part, I'll preface this by saying this whole exercise is supposed to be fast. It's a design charrette. It's not, the design is not the important part here. The important part in this assignment is that you experience how to get through an idea in a short time frame, and you're actually able to articulate an idea from start to finish. That's really it. If you can do that throughout the whole process, you're gold. So at this stage right now, are there any questions? I know it feels really abstract because I haven't shown you anything about it yet, but any questions? Yvonne, you look like you've got one right there.
Is it going to be similar to what your project you proposed, like where we're pulling the dances or biorhythms or sleep patterns?
Well, I'll show you. What I actually, that's a perfect segue into, let's talk about the inspiration. So this is kind of basic inspiration. Okay, so mine was really abstract and also potentially very complex because it was music, right? Music is very technically complex. So I figure if you don't have some inspiration of your own, I'm offering this up to you as a place to begin because it shares some similarity to the impetus for the idea of this assignment. So basically, using masters of design, so we've got Frank Lloyd Wright on the left and his stained glass geometrical patterning, and then we've got Wassily Kandinsky on the right and his paintings that also use geometry and color to compose rather interesting compositions in a two-dimensional fashion. Both of these have somewhat abstract underlying structure and systems, so it's not just, you know, like a symmetrical pattern that you can say, you know, I've got line here, line there, line here, line there, right? You need to think about it a little bit. You need to think about in the top left corner that it does actually have a center line, but the center line is balanced. You've got about 60% of your articulation on one side and then about 40% of your geometrical articulation on the other. Likewise, if you split it horizontally, you've got, in the same fashion, you've got about 60% of the pattern. I should just show you this way. Going across this way, right? You've got like 60% articulation over there compared to about 40% articulation here, right? That's what I mean. Then you cut it horizontally and you've got the same thing in this quadrant, about 60% versus about 40% there, right? But the percentage really doesn't matter. What you would take away from that is that what you're doing in your design is you're splitting, whatever way that looks, and then you're assigning a gradient of, you know, whatever kind of geometrical density, right? That would be the rule set that you establish. Do you guys kind of get that? And then so for the Kandinsky compositions, right? These are a little more abstract, right? A little bit harder to identify. But what you would focus on is the fact that there are two primary geometries, right? This one is very object-like, and this one is very, linear. And then this one has primarily two types of linear elements. It has straight ones and it has curves, right? So then your rule would be that you can only use, full-on French curve, and you can only use straight lines. And then you might take it a step further and say your straight lines have to be horizontal. Your curves can change in the vertical axis. Stuff like that. Okay, you can graft in some systems with that. But I would say that you need to get to a stage where you've probably got about 3 solid rules to govern your work. I should probably write that in. That's one of the things that I need to clarify. But if you just figured out like 3 solid rules, like this one, you have primarily 3 sections, right? So you would do your 60-40, and then you would say, I'm going to subdivide it 3 ways and have 3 different sections of my site in some way. And then the other one would be that you're using purely diagonal lines and orthogonal lines. Like nothing else. You're not going to use any curves, anything like that. Purely 45-degree diagonal lines or whatever that is, and orthogonal lines. So that I would consider that a full analysis of that particular piece. You guys starting to get it? So this is all just step 1. Now, that should be done in about a half an hour here in class. And then I'm going to come around and I'll chat with each of you about what you've done for it before we move on and actually start to lay out the geometry, which is what you see down the bottom there. And you can't really see it very well, but this was just the 2-dimensional articulation of that system, right? So hopefully in class today, we get to a point where we've gotten through steps 1 and step 2, maybe completed step 2, hopefully at least very close. Okay? What questions do you have? Yes?
Can you say we can use one of the pictures that you provided?
You can use one of the pictures that I provided, since I already went through a full analysis of the one in the top left. I'd say don't use that one. But so I would suggest, though, that you Google both Wassily Kandinsky and Frank Lloyd Wright for their artwork and understand a little bit about the variety of their artwork. And if you have any other influences in your life that you think might relate and you want to have me just comment on it and see if it's got enough substance, feel free. Or if you're confident, you can use whatever you like. It's a good question. Okay, so it is currently 7:27-ish. So I want to probably start making rounds in about 15 minutes to just kind of check in. So I'll stop in with whoever has a little bit more work done. But at 8 o'clock, I'm hoping we can start transitioning into the actual patterning exercise.